A Goboto Night, a short story by Jack London. 1. At Goboto, the traders come off their schooners and the planters drift in from far, wild coasts, and one and all they assume shoes, white duck trousers, and various other appearances of civilization. At Goboto, mail is received, bills are paid, and newspapers, rarely more than 5 weeks old, are accessible. For the little island, belted with its coral reefs, affords safe anchorage, is the steamer port of call, and serves as the distributing point for the whole wide scattered group. Life at Goboto is heated, unhealthy, and lurid, and for its size, it asserts the distinction of more cases of acute alcoholism than any other spot in the world. Govutu, over in the Solomons, claims that it drinks between drinks. Goboto does not deny this. It merely states, in passing, that in the Gobotan chronology, no such interval of time is known. It also points out its import statistics, which show a far larger per capita consumption of spirituous liquors. Govutu explains this on the basis that Goboto does a larger business and has more visitors. Goboto retorts that its resident population is smaller and that its visitors are thirstier, and the discussion goes on interminably, principally because of the fact that the disputants do not live long enough to settle it. Goboto is not large. The island is only 1/4 of a mile in diameter, and on it are situated an Admiralty coal shed, where a few tons of coal have lain untouched for 20 years, the barracks for a handful of black labourers, a big store and warehouse with sheet-iron roofs, and a bungalow inhabited by the manager and his 2 clerks. They are the white population. An average of 1 man out of the 3 is always to be found down with fever. The job at Goboto is a hard one. It is the policy of the company to treat its patrons well, as invading companies have found out, and it is the task of the manager and clerks to do the treating. Throughout the year, traders and recruiters arrive from far, dry cruises and planters from equally distant and dry shores, bringing with them magnificent thirsts. Goboto is the mecca of sprees, and when they have spreed, they go back to their schooners and plantations to recuperate. Some of the less hardy require as much as 6 months between visits, but for the manager and his assistants, there are no such intervals. They are on the spot and week. By week, blown in by monsoon or southeast trade, the schooners come to anchor, cargoed with copra, ivory nuts, pearl shell, hawksbill turtle, and thirst. It is a very hard job at Goboto. That is why the pay is twice that on other stations, and that is why the company selects only courageous and intrepid men for this particular station. They last no more than a year or so, when the wreckage of them is shipped back to Australia, or the remains of them are buried in the sand across on the windward side of the islet. Johnny Bassett, almost the legendary hero of Goboto, broke all records. He was a remittance man with a remarkable constitution, and he lasted 7 years. His dying request was duly observed by his clerks, who pickled him in a cask of trade rum, paid for out of their own salaries, and shipped him back to his people in England. Nevertheless, at Goboto, they tried to be gentlemen. For that matter, though something was wrong with them, they were gentlemen and had been gentlemen. That was why the great unwritten rule of Goboto was that visitors should put on pants and shoes. Breechclouts, lavas, and bare legs were not tolerated. When Captain Jensen, the wildest of the blackbirders though descended from old New York Knickerbocker stock, surged in, clad in loincloth, undershirt, 2 belted revolvers, and a sheath knife, he was stopped at the beach. This was in the days of Johnny Bassett, ever a stickler in matters of etiquette. Captain Jensen stood up in the stern sheets of his whaleboat and denied the existence of pants on his schooner. Also, he affirmed his intention of coming ashore. They of Goboto nursed him back to health from a bullet hole through his shoulder, and in addition handsomely begged his pardon, for no pants had they found on his schooner. And finally, on the first day he sat up, Johnny Bassett kindly but firmly assisted his guest into a pair of pants of his own. This was the great precedent. In all the succeeding years, it had never been violated. White men and pants were undivorceable, Only niggers ran naked. Pants constituted caste. 2. On this night, things were, with one exception, in no wise different from any other night. 7 of them, with glimmering eyes and steady legs, had capped a day of scotch with swivel-sticked cocktails and sat down to dinner. Jacketed, trousered, and shod, they were Jerry McMurtry, the manager, Eddie Little and Jack Andrews, clerks, Captain Stapler of the recruiting Ketchmerry, Darby Shrilton, planter from Tito Ito, Peter G., a half-caste Chinese pearl buyer who ranged from Ceylon to the Paumotus, and Alfred Deacon, a visitor who had stopped off from the last steamer. At first, wine was served by the black servants to those that drank it, though all quickly shifted back to scotch and soda, pickling their food as they ate it, ere it went into their calcined, pickled stomachs. Over their coffee, they heard the rumble of an anchor chain through a hawse pipe, tokening the arrival of a vessel. "It's David Grief," Peter G. remarked. "How do you know?" Deacon demanded truculently, and then went on to deny the half-caste's knowledge. "You chaps put on a lot of side over a new chum. I've done some sailing myself, and this naming a craft when its sail is only a blur, or naming a man by the sound of his anchor, it's unadulterated poppycock." Peter G. was engaged in lighting a cigarette and did not answer. "Some of the niggers do amazing things that way," McMurtry interposed tactfully. As with the others, this conduct of their visitor jarred on the manager. From the moment of Peter G.'s arrival that afternoon, Deacon had manifested a tendency to pick on him. He had disputed his statements and been generally rude. "Maybe it's because Peter's got chink blood in him," had been Andrew's hypothesis. "Deacon's Australian, you know, and they're daffy down there on colour." "I fancy that's it," McMurtry had agreed. "But we can't permit any bullying, especially of a man like Peter G., who's whiter than most white men." In this, the manager had been in no wise wrong. Peter G. was that rare creature, a good as well as clever Eurasian. In fact, it was the stolid integrity of the Chinese blood that toned the recklessness and licentiousness of the English blood which had run in his father's veins. Also, he was better educated than any man there, spoke better English as well as several other tongues, and knew and lived more of their own ideals of gentlemanliness than they did themselves. And finally, he was a gentle soul. Violence he deprecated, though he had killed men in his time. Turbulence he abhorred. He always avoided it, as he would the plague. Captain Stapler stepped in to help McMurtry. "I remember, when I changed schooners and came into Altman, the niggers knew right off the bat it was me. I wasn't expected either, much less to be in another craft. They told the trader it was me. He used the glasses and wouldn't believe them, but they did know. Told me afterward they could see it sticking out all over the schooner that I was running her." Deacon ignored him and returned to the attack on the pearl buyer. "How do you know from the sound of the anchor that it was this whatever you called him man?" he challenged. "There are so many things that go to make up such a judgment," Peter G. answered. "It's very hard to explain. It would require almost a textbook." "I thought so," Deacon sneered. "Explanation that doesn't explain is easy. Who's for bridge?" Eddie Little, the second clerk, interrupted, looking up expectantly and starting to shuffle. "You'll play, won't you, Peter?" "If he does, he's a bluffer," Deacon cut back. "I'm getting tired of all this poppycock. Mr. G., you will favour me and put yourself in a better light if you tell how you know who that man was that just dropped anchor. After that, I'll play you piquet." "I prefer bridge," Peter answered. "As for the other thing, it's something like this. By the sound, it was a small craft, no square rigger, no whistle, no siren was blown. Again, a small craft. It anchored close in. Still again, a small craft. For steamers and big ships must drop hook outside the middle shoal. Now the entrance is tortuous. There is no recruiting nor trading captain in the group who dares to run the passage after dark. Certainly no stranger would. There were 2 exceptions. The first was Marganville, but he was executed by the High Court at Fiji. Remains the other exception, David Grief. Night or day, in any weather, he runs the passage. This is well known to all. A possible factor, in case Grief were somewhere else, would be some young daredevil of a skipper. In this connection, in the first place, I don't know of any, nor does anybody else. In the second place, David Grief is in these waters, cruising on the Gunga, which is shortly scheduled to leave here for Caro Caro. I spoke to Grief on the Gunga in Sandfly Passage, day before yesterday. He was putting a trader ashore on a new station. He said he was going to call in at Babo and then come on to Goboto. He has had ample time to get here. I have heard an anchor drop. Who else than David Grief can it be? Captain Donovan is skipper of the Gunga, and him I know too well to believe that he'd run into Goboto after dark unless his owner were in charge. In a few minutes, David Grief will enter through that door and say, "In Guvutu, they merely drink between drinks." I'll wager £50 he's the man that enters, and that his words will be, "In Guvutu, they merely drink between drinks." Deacon was for the moment crushed. The sullen blood rose darkly in his face. "Well, he's answered you," McMurtry laughed genially, "and I'll back his bet myself for a couple of sovereigns." "Bridge! Who's going to take a hand?" Eddie Little cried impatiently. "Come on, Peter." "The rest of you play," Deacon said. "He and I are going to play piquet." "I'd prefer bridge," Peter G. said mildly. "Don't you play piquet?" The pearl buyer nodded. "Then come on. Maybe I can show I know more about that than I do about anchors." "Oh, I say," McMurtry began. "You can play bridge," Deacon shut him off. "We prefer piquet." Reluctantly, Peter G. was bullied into a game that he knew would be unhappy. "Only a rubber," he said as he cut for deal. "For how much?" Deacon asked. Peter G. shrugged his shoulders. "As you please." "100 up? £5 a game?" Peter G. agreed. With the lurch double, of course. £10. "All right," said Peter G. At another table, 4 of the others sat in at bridge. Captain Stapler, who was no card player, looked on and replenished the long glasses of scotch that stood at each man's right hand. McMurtry, with poorly concealed apprehension, followed as well as he could what went on at the piquet table. His fellow Englishmen as well were shocked by the behaviour of the Australian, and all were troubled by fear of some untoward act on his part, that he was working up his animosity against the half-caste, and that the explosion might come any time, was apparent to all. "I hope Peter loses," McMurtry said in an undertone. "Not if he has any luck," Andrews answered. "He's a wizard at piquet. I know by experience." That Peter G. was lucky was patent from the continual badgering of Deacon, who filled his glass frequently. He had lost the first game, and from his remarks was losing the second, when the door opened and David Grief entered. "In Guvutu they merely drink between drinks," he remarked casually to the assembled company ere he gripped the manager's hand. "Hello, Mac. Say, my skipper's down in the whaleboat. He's got a silk shirt, a tie, and tennis shoes, all complete, but he wants you to send a pair of pants down. Mine are too small, but yours will fit him. Hello, Eddie. How's that Ngari? You up, Jock? The miracle has happened. No one down with fever, and no one remarkably drunk." He sighed. "I suppose the night is young yet." "Hello, Peter. Did you catch that big squall an hour after you left us? We had to let go the second anchor." While he was being introduced to Deacon, McMurtry dispatched a houseboy with the pants, and when Captain Donovan came in, it was as a white man should, at least in Goboto. Deacon lost the second game, and an outburst heralded the fact. Peter G. devoted himself to lighting a cigarette and keeping quiet. "What? Are you quitting because you're ahead?" Deacon demanded. Grief raised his eyebrows questioningly to McMurtry, who frowned back his own disgust. "It's the rubber," Peter G. answered. "It takes 3 games to make a rubber. It's my deal. Come on." Peter G. acquiesced, and the third game was on. "Young whelp! He needs a lacing," McMurtry muttered to Grief. "Come on, let us quit, you chaps. I want to keep an eye on him. If he goes too far, I'll throw him out on the beach, company instructions or no." "Who is he?" Grief queried. "A leftover from last steamer. Company's orders to treat him nice. He's looking to invest in a plantation. Has a £10,000 letter of credit with the company. He's got all white Australia on the brain. Thinks because his skin is white and because his father was once Attorney General of the Commonwealth that he can be a cur. That's why he's picking on Peter. And you know Peter's the last man in the world to make trouble or incur trouble. Damn the company. I didn't engage to wet nurse its infants with bank accounts. Come on, fill your glass, Grief. The man's a blighter, a blithering blighter. Maybe he's only young, Grief suggested. He can't contain his drink, that's clear. The manager glared his disgust and wrath. If he raises a hand to Peter, so help me, I'll give him a licking myself, the little overgrown cad. The pearl buyer pulled the pegs out of the cribbage board on which he was scoring and sat back. He had won the third game. He glanced across to Eddie Little, saying, "I'm ready for the bridge now." "I wouldn't be a quitter," Deacon snarled. "Oh, really? I'm tired of the game," Peter G. assured him with his habitual quietness. "Come on and be game," Deacon bullied. "One more. You can't take my money that way. I'm out £15. Double or quits." McMurtry was about to interpose, but Grief restrained him with his eyes. "If it positively is the last, all right," said Peter G., gathering up the cards. "It's my deal, I believe. As I understand it, this final is for £15. Either you owe me 30, or we quit even." "That's it, chappie. Either we break even or I pay you 30. "Getting blooded, eh?" Grief remarked, drawing up a chair. The other men stood or sat around the table, and Deacon played again in bad luck. That he was a good player was clear. The cards were merely running against him. That he could not take his ill luck with equanimity was equally clear. He was guilty of sharp, ugly curses, and he snapped and growled at the imperturbable half-caste. In the end, Peter G. counted out, while Deacon had not even made his 50 points. He glowered speechlessly at his opponent. "Looks like a lurch," said Grief. "Which is double," said Peter G. "There's no need your telling me," Deacon snarled. "I've studied arithmetic. I owe you £45. There, take it." The way in which he flung the 9 £5 notes on the table was an insult in itself. Peter G. was even quieter and flew no signals of resentment. "You've got fool's luck, but you can't play cards. I can tell you that much," Deacon went on. "I could teach you cards." The half-caste smiled and nodded acquiescence as he folded up the money. "There's a little game called Casino. I wonder if you ever heard of it? A child's game." "I've seen it played," the half-caste murmured gently. "What's that?" snapped Deacon. "Maybe you think you can play it?" "Oh, no, not for a moment. I'm afraid I haven't head enough for it." "It's a bully game, Casino," Grief broke in pleasantly. "I like it very much." Deacon ignored him. "I'll play you 10 quid a game, 31 points out," was the challenge to Peter G. "And I'll show you how little you know about cards. Come on, where's a full deck?" "No, thanks," the half-caste answered. "They are waiting for me in order to make up a bridge set." "Yes, come on," Eddie Little begged eagerly. "Come on, Peter, let's get started." "Afraid of a little game like Casino?" Deacon girded. "Maybe the stakes are too high. I'll play you for pennies, or farthings if you say so." The man's conduct was a hurt and an affront to all of them. McMurtry could stand it no longer. "Now hold on, Deacon. He says he doesn't want to play. Let him alone." Deacon turned raging upon his host, but before he could blurt out his abuse, Grief had stepped into the breach. "I'd like to play Casino with you," he said. "What do you know about it?" "Not much, but I'm willing to learn." "Well, I'm not teaching for pennies tonight." "Oh, that's all right," Grief answered. "I'll play for almost any sum. Within reason, of course." Deacon proceeded to dispose of this intruder with one stroke. "I'll play you £100 a game, if that will do you any good." Grief beamed his delight. "That will be all right. Very right. Let us begin. Do you count sweeps?" Deacon was taken aback. He had not expected a Goboton trader to be anything but crushed by such a proposition. "Do you count sweeps?" Grief repeated. Andrews had brought him a new deck, and he was throwing out the joker. "Certainly not," Deacon answered. "That's a sissy game." "I'm glad." Grief coincided. "I don't like sissy games either." "You don't, eh? Well then, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll play for £500 a game." Again, Deacon was taken aback. "I'm agreeable," Grief said, beginning to shuffle. "Cards and spades go out first, of course, and then big and little casino, and the aces in the bridge order of value. Is that right?" "You're a lot of jokers down here," Deacon laughed, but his laughter was strained. "How do I know you've got the money?" "By the same token, I know you've got it. Mac, how's my credit with the company?" "For all you want," the manager answered. "You personally guarantee that?" Deacon demanded. "I certainly do," McMurtry said. "Depend upon it, the company will honor his paper up and pass your letter of credit." "Low deals," Grief said, placing the deck before Deacon on the table. The latter hesitated in the midst of the cut and looked around with querulous misgiving at the faces of the others. The clerks and captains nodded. "You're all strangers to me," Deacon complained. "How am I to know? Money on paper isn't always the real thing." Then it was that Peter G., drawing a wallet from his pocket and borrowing a fountain pen from McMurtry, went into action. "I haven't gone to buying yet," the half-caste explained, "so the account is intact. I'll just endorse it over to you, Grief. It's for 15,000. There, look at it." Deacon intercepted the letter of credit as it was being passed across the table. He read it slowly, then glanced up at McMurtry. "Is that right?" "Yes, it's just the same as your own and just as good. The company's paper is always good." Deacon cut the cards, won the deal, and gave them a thorough shuffle. But his luck was still against him, and he lost the game. "Another game," he said. "We didn't say how many, and you can't quit with me a loser. I want action." Grief shuffled and passed the cards for the cut. "Let's play for 1,000, Deacon said, when he had lost the second game. And when the 1,000 had gone the way of the two 500 bets, he proposed to play for 2,000. "That's progression," McMurtry warned, and was rewarded by a glare from Deacon. But the manager was insistent. "You don't have to play progression, Grief, unless you're foolish." "Who's playing this game?" Deacon flamed at his host, and then to Grief. "I've lost 2,000 to you. Will you play for 2,000? Grief nodded. The fourth game began, and Deacon won. The manifest unfairness of such betting was known to all of them. Though he had lost 3 games out of 4, Deacon had lost no money. By the child's device of doubling his wager with each loss, he was bound, with the first game he won, no matter how long delayed, to be even again. He now evinced an unspoken desire to stop, but Grief passed the deck to be cut. "What?" Deacon cried. "You want more?" "Haven't got anything yet," Grief murmured whimsically as he began the deal. "For the usual 500, I suppose." The shame of what he had done must have tingled in Deacon, for he answered, "No, we'll play for 1,000. And say, 31 points is too long. Why not 21 points out, if it isn't too rapid for you?" "That will make it a nice, quick little game," Grief agreed. The former method of play was repeated. Deacon lost 2 games, doubled the stake, and was again even. But Grief was patient, though the thing occurred several times in the next hour's play. Then happened what he was waiting for, a lengthening in the series of losing games for Deacon. The latter doubled to 4,000 and lost, doubled to 8,000 and lost, and then proposed to double to 16,000. Grief shook his head. "You can't do that, you know. You're only 10,000 credit with the company." "You mean you won't give me action?" Deacon asked hoarsely. "You mean that with 8,000 of my money, you're going to quit?" Grief smiled and shook his head. "It's robbery, plain robbery," Deacon went on. "You take my money and won't give me action." "No, you're wrong. I'm perfectly willing to give you what action you've got coming to you. You've got £2,000 of action yet." "Well, we'll play it." Deacon took him up. "You cut." The game was played in silence, save for irritable remarks and curses from Deacon. Silently, the onlookers filled and sipped their long Scotch glasses. Grief took no notice of his opponent's outbursts, but concentrated on the game. He was really playing cards, and there were 52 in the deck to be kept track of, and of which he did keep track. Two-thirds of the way through the last deal, he threw down his hand. "Cards put me out," he said. "I have 27. "If you've made a mistake," Deacon threatened, his face white and drawn, "then I shall have lost. Count them." Grief passed over his stack of takings, and Deacon, with trembling fingers, verified the count. He half-shoved his chair back from the table and emptied his glass. He looked about him at unsympathetic faces. "I fancy I'll be catching the next steamer for Sydney," he said, and for the first time his speech was quiet and without bluster. As Grief told them afterward, had he whined or raised a roar, I wouldn't have given him that last chance. As it was, he took his medicine like a man, and I had to do it. Deacon glanced at his watch, simulated a weary yawn, and started to rise. "Wait," Grief said. "Do you want further action?" The other sank down in his chair, strove to speak but could not, licked his dry lips, and nodded his head. "Captain Donovan here sails at daylight in the Gunga for Karo Karo," Grief began with seeming irrelevance. Karo Karo is a ring of sand in the sea with a few thousand coconut trees. Pandanus grows there, but they can't grow sweet potatoes nor taro. There are about 800 natives, a king and 2 prime ministers, and the last 3 named are the only ones who wear any clothes. It's a sort of god-forsaken little hole, and once a year I send a schooner up from Goboto. The drinking water is brackish, but old Tom Butler has survived on it for a dozen years. He's the only white man there, and he has a boat's crew of 5 Santa Cruz boys who would run away or kill him if they could. That is why they were sent there. They can't run away. He is always supplied with the hard cases from the plantations. There are no missionaries. 2 native Samoan teachers were clubbed to death on the beach when they landed several years ago. Naturally, you're wondering what it is all about, but have patience. As I have said, Captain Donovan sails on the annual trip to Karo Karo at daylight tomorrow. Tom Butler is old and getting quite helpless. I've tried to retire him to Australia, but he says he wants to remain and die on Karo Karo, and he will in the next year or so. He's a queer old codger. Now the time is due for me to send some white man up to take the work off his hands. I wonder how you'd like the job. You'd have to stay 2 years. Hold on! I've not finished. You've talked frequently of action this evening. There's no action in betting away what you've never sweated for. The money you've lost to me was left you by your father or some other relative who did the sweating. But 2 years of work as trader on Karo Karo would mean something. I'll bet the 10,000 I've won from you against 2 years of your time. If you win, the money's yours. If you lose, you take the job at Karo Karo and sail at daylight. Now that's what might be called real action. Will you play? Deacon could not speak. His throat lumped and he nodded his head as he reached for the cards. "One thing more," Grief said. "I can do even better. If you lose, 2 years of your time are mine, naturally without wages. Nevertheless, I'll pay you wages. If your work is satisfactory, if you observe all instructions and rules, I'll pay you £5,000 a year for 2 years. The money will be deposited with the company to be paid to you with interest when the time expires. Is that all right?" "Too much so," Deacon stammered. "You are unfair to yourself. A trader only gets £10 or £15 a month." "Put it down to action, then," Grief said, with an air of dismissal. "And before we begin, I'll jot down several of the rules. These you will repeat aloud every morning during the 2 years, if you lose. They are for the good of your soul. When you have repeated them aloud 730 Karo Karo mornings, I am confident they will be in your memory to stay. Lend me your pen, Mac. Now, let's see." He wrote steadily and rapidly for some minutes, then proceeded to read the matter aloud. "I must always remember that one man is as good as another, save and except when he thinks he is better. No matter how drunk I am, I must not fail to be a gentleman. A gentleman is a man who is gentle. Note, it would be better not to get drunk. When I play a man's game with men, I must play like a man. A good curse, rightly used and rarely, is an efficient thing. Too many curses spoil the cursing. Note, a curse cannot change a card sequence nor cause the wind to blow. There is no license for a man to be less than a man. £10,000 cannot purchase such a license. At the beginning of the reading, Deacon's face had gone white with anger. Then had arisen, from neck to forehead, a slow and terrible flush that deepened to the end of the reading. "There, that will be all," Grief said, as he folded the paper and tossed it to the center of the table. "Are you still ready to play the game?" "I deserve it," Deacon muttered brokenly. "I've been an ass. Mr. G, before I know whether I win or lose, I want to apologize. Maybe it was the whiskey, I don't know, but I'm an ass, a cad, a bounder, everything that's rotten." He held out his hand, and the half-caste took it beamingly. "I say, Grief," he blurted out, "the boy's all right. Call the whole thing off, and let's forget it in a final nightcap." Grief showed signs of debating, but Deacon cried, "No, I won't permit it. I'm not a quitter. If it's caro, it's caro. There's nothing more to it." "Right," said Grief, as he began the shuffle. "If he's the right stuff to go to caro won't do him any harm." The game was close and hard. 3 times they divided the deck between them, and cards was not scored. At the beginning of the 5th and last deal, Deacon needed 3 points to go out, and Grief needed 4. Cards alone would put Deacon out, and he played for cards. He no longer muttered or cursed, and played his best game of the evening. Incidentally, he gathered in the 2 black aces and the ace of hearts. "I suppose you can name the 4 cards I hold," he challenged, as the last of the deal was exhausted, and he picked up his hand. Grief nodded. "Then name them." "The knave of spades, the deuce of spades, the trey of hearts, and the ace of diamonds," Grief answered. Those behind Deacon and looking at his hand made no sign, yet the naming had been correct. "I fancy you play casino better than I," Deacon acknowledged. "I can name only 3 of yours, a knave, an ace, and big casino." "Wrong. There aren't 5 aces in the deck. You've taken in 3, and you hold the 4th in your hand now." "By Jove, you're right," Deacon admitted. "I did scoop in 3. Anyway, I'll make. Cards on you. That's all I need." "I'll let you save little casino." Grief paused to calculate. "Yes, and the ace as well, and still I'll make cards and go out with big casino. Play." "No cards, and I win," Deacon exulted as the last of the hand was played. "I go out on little casino and the 4 aces. Big casino and spades only bring you to 20. Grief shook his head. "Some mistake, I'm afraid." "No," Deacon declared positively. "I counted every card I took in. That's the one thing I was correct on. I've 26, and you've 26. "Count again," Grief said. Carefully and slowly, with trembling fingers, Deacon counted the cards he had taken. There were 25. He reached over to the corner of the table, took up the rules Grief had written, folded them, and put them in his pocket. Then he emptied his glass and stood up. Captain Donovan looked at his watch, yawned, and also arose. "Going aboard, Captain?" Deacon asked. "Yes," was the answer. "What time shall I send the whaleboat for you?" "I'll go with you now. We'll pick up my luggage from the billy as we go by. I was sailing on her for Babo in the morning." Deacon shook hands all around, after receiving a final pledge of good luck on caro. "Does Tom Butler play cards?" he asked Grief. "Solitaire," was the answer. "Then I'll teach him double solitaire." Deacon turned toward the door, where Captain Donovan waited, and added with a sigh, "And I fancy he'll skin me too, if he plays like the rest of you island men."